Welcome, everyone. I'm Tom Dineen, president of the Maryland Association of Scholars, which is one of the state affiliates of the National Association of Scholars, or NAS. Today, I'm honored to have with me Professor George La Noue, who was my predecessor as president of the MAS, as well as its primary founder back in 2023. George is Emeritus Professor of Political Science and of Public Policy at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and at the University of Maryland Graduate School of Graduate School of Baltimore. Prior to coming to University of Maryland, George was director of the Columbia University Teachers College graduate program in politics and education. He is also taught at American University, the universities of Chicago, Miami, and Strasbourg. He graduated from Hanover College in Indiana, magna cum laude, in 1959, and then received his MA and Ph.D. in political science from Yale. The Ph.D. is 1966, so that may be a transitional period in United States culture, which I think of the late 60s as the period of upheaval, especially since we both have Columbia University connections. Columbia in 1968 is sort of the epicenter of campus explosion, so I'll be interested to get into that. George has been awarded the Woodrow Wilson, the Danforth, and Public Administration National Fellowships. His research is focused on education law, civil rights law, and public policy. He has published 6 books and numerous articles. 2 of his books are of tremendous interest, especially given current activities on campus. His most recent book is Silenced Stages: The Loss of Academic Freedom and Campus Policy Debates, and that's from 2019. And this focus on campus controversy goes back all the way to the 1980s in George's scholarship. He wrote in 1987, Academics in Court: The Consequences of Academic Discrimination Litigation. So with that, welcome, George, and I'll ask you briefly to go into your educational history. I believe you're from Indiana, and you went to Hanover College, small liberal arts school, and I think the transition from Hanover to Yale University would be of interest if you maybe want to get into that and talk about the cultural shift and what things were like back in the, I guess, mid to late or middle 60s, or actually early 1960s at Yale when you started your graduate studies.
So at Hanover, I majored in political science and history and minored in economics. Was fortunate to have a professors who were very good mentors and helped me transition to Yale. But Yale's a very different place, and the 9 students in my PhD class all had come from campuses where their professors had written the books that we studied at Yale. And my background was different. I grew up in Gary, Indiana. My family were largely industrial workers, but I had experiences that other people didn't have at least in the political science department, and so I was not at all uncomfortable, and I was permitted to take about 40% of my work at Yale Law School. I also took 2 courses in the Yale Divinity School because I wanted to study what kinds of realities there were in relationships between the federal government and religious organizations, even though the constitutional concept is separation of church and state. That led to a career path that I admit I certainly didn't anticipate, but has worked out, that mostly my scholarship focuses on what the social sciences have to say about various constitutional issues. And I have developed that for quite a number of years, and also in work for the federal government and as a consultant. So my dissertation was about what are the realities in terms of the federal government's relationship with religious organizations. 435-page dissertation, all typed in those days. Uh, and one of the reasons for the interest in that is when uh, President Kennedy campaigned, he campaigned on the idea of creating the Peace Corps. And when he took office, he said, "Well, we have a number of American organizations already working in third world countries. Why don't we just fund those organizations?" And someone said, "Mr. President, most of them are missionary organizations, and it would not be a good idea for the federal government and for you as the first Catholic president to be funding missionary organizations." So from that, but of course, the overseas organizations were happy to get funded and did not want to have a secular counterpart or even a rival. So the dissertation is about that political debate where finally it emerges that the Peace Corps was established as entirely a secular federal government organization. So that was the first time I really looked at uh, constitutional issues from a governmental or a social science perspective.
Very interesting. Um, what was the atmosphere like politically at a place like Yale, and with our background at Columbia University, Columbia being held up as the epicenter of campus protests, or the perhaps the most publicized university back in the late '60s, where they had explosive protests resulting in arrests and violence in the early to mid '60s when you were at Yale. Was any of that kind of festering, or was that an issue? Or was that a later '60s issue?
I think it was a later 60s issue, and I was so focused on my particular work that I would not have been a participant in campus political activities. And those were essentially undergraduate activities. The graduate students did not get much involved in that kind of thing. Um, I can tell you just one brief story. In the Hall of Graduate Studies, in the dorm room next to mine, were two Russian students. And they spoke English, of course, but I didn't get to know them very soon. But eventually I did get to know them. And I offered one day to drive them around New Haven. And on the stops, I stopped at a large supermarket. And they said, "Who shops there?" Because they were noticing the cars in the parking lot. I said, "Well, just the people who live and work in New Haven." Impossible. Workers do not have cars like that. It was kind of an interesting experience. But politically, I was certainly not active as a graduate student.
That's funny, and that echoes some of what Juliana, our fellow board member on the MAS, said about her experience as an emigre from Romania, communist Romania, back in, I guess it was the '50s or '60s, and this perception of getting to American college campuses. In her case, University of Chicago, and having left-wing American academics venerating left-wing thinking and specifically Marxism, maybe less so at the University of Chicago, but from our own experience of the implementation of Marxist-Leninism, she had a different view of what things were really like in countries that went through with full implementation, compared with the freedom she had in America and the relative prosperity of the working class. And there's a real disjunction between the philosophical academic idealization of something you've never experienced versus the actual experience of people like your Russian fellow students actually seeing what it's like for workers being not that bad in the United States. It's a strange dichotomy. Um, so you graduated from Yale, and then I want to also get a little into your volunteer experiences. You've had them throughout your life. Um, which maybe if you choose some of them, which were the more fulfilling and which had the most impact? Maybe which did you find not as satisfying? What's been your experience there?
Well, before I became director of public policy PhD program at UMBC, uh, I had a number of volunteer experiences. I suppose the two that were the most significant is because of my dissertation, I became kind of the church state expert for the National Council of Churches, which is located about 3 blocks from the Columbia campus on Riverside Drive. And I became one of their policy developers and eventually testified before Congress on behalf of the National Council of Churches several times. Simultaneously, I became a board member of the New York Civil Liberties Union, which was also interested in First Amendment church state issues and developed their policies. So those were both volunteer activities. Um, Later in life, when as director of public policy, became a member of a number of Maryland commissions that were looking at various things because they thought somebody who was directing public policy would be a useful addition. Um, and probably the most interesting one was essentially a failure. Um, Kurt Schmoke, who is a very well-educated person and is now president of the University of Baltimore, was mayor of Baltimore for, I think, 2 terms.
Mhm.
And he recognized that that Baltimore public education had a great number of problems, which unfortunately still exist. So he created a task force to look at school choice. And he actually wanted us to recommend a voucher system. Well, the group that he put together was not going to go that far, but they did recommend a loosening up of enrollment patterns and the possibility of some public support for private institutions in Baltimore. But that didn't go anywhere, as one would predict. But that was an interesting experience to get a mayor to say, "Look, what can we do to solve this problem that still exists today?"
Hmm. Um, does it exist kind of in the same way, or what's been the evolution of problems in the Baltimore public school system? I mean, as I'm a Baltimore resident myself, my daughter went entirely to private schools. I know it's a perennial problem, but uh, given that you've been around in the area for so long, have you seen major changes, or have things gotten worse or better, or what are the major issues?
I really can't answer that question because I am not up to date in. I know test scores are still bad, and there's a lot of absenteeism in the schools, and they're having difficulty recruiting teachers, even though they've created a substantial increase in pay packages. But it would be wrong for me to try to compare over the decades the changes in Baltimore public schools because I just haven't studied that.
Yeah, got it. Um, Another volunteer effort that both you and I were involved in. Maybe you can speak to that, or the general experience of having served on the Maryland Advisory Committee to the United States Commission on Civil Rights, which I have you to thank for getting me involved. And the USCCR, of course, is the federal agency that is tasked with civil rights concerns. I know you served on the Maryland committee for a number of years, and we kind of discussed it frankly, and it's challenging, I find, because of somewhat because of the bureaucratic structure of the organization. I've also found the political allegiances can be unpredictably shifting on the committee of Maryland. What were your experiences on that committee?
Well, I served as vice president for several years, uh, and there were many people on the Maryland State Commission who were quite uh, active and concerned and well informed. But the problem is that they're all volunteers. They don't have a research staff. They don't have any budget. And so there is a tendency to take on very complex problems, which are dealt with by having one day of hearings. And the participants are all in the hearings are all volunteers. And so you may get a very unbalanced record. For example, one of the problems that we took up when I was on the commission was school discipline. And we invited speakers from the various educational organizations in the state and from organizations that were concerned with student rights, et cetera. And it turned out that all of the public school organizations refused to appear. So the only witnesses we had were American Civil Liberties Union, the NAACP, et cetera, who were very critical of disciplining students. So we didn't really have a record that had any depth to it or balance to it. And the report that was issued reflected that imbalanced record. I had to write a dissent. And so, in that sense, as well-meaning as these commissions are, they really don't have the resources to deal with the complex problems that they choose to investigate.
Very interesting. Yeah, that reflects my much shorter experience so far. I've been doing this for less than a year on the Maryland committee, and initially there's there's a lot of political dissent, especially given how polarized our current political atmosphere is. But the classic dichotomy is civil rights have traditionally been more of a left wing or liberal initiative. Only now are conservatives beginning to form coalitions that represent something that's an alternative to those left wing assumptions about civil rights. But for decades, it's been a lot of the left wing coalitions on the state committees calling all the shots and inviting all of the experts in, and it's resulted in very one-sided evaluation of a lot of these topics. And to some extent, that's what we've been facing. But your point about their lack of true expertise and the way that people are invited in, and it doesn't result in terrific outcomes. I think that's kind of been the case, but trying to redress that. You also work for three federal agencies, or with three federal agencies. Maybe you could talk about that as a maybe that sounds like a more fertile set of interactions.
I in 1979, excuse me, in 1972, I became assistant to the executive director of the United States Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. I was a public administration fellow, and public administration fellows, like White House fellows or congressional fellows, actually work for a year in the federal government. And what was interesting about that assignment is EEOC had just been given statutory authority to deal with employment in faculty employment. I didn't quite know what to do with that mandate. And so my responsibility there was twofold. One is to help the organization think through the implications of tenure, for example. Is tenure kind of a seniority system? How are faculty members paid? Because the systems for payment vary a great deal. So my job was to provide policy recommendations and to go around the country and speak to educational organizations and say, EEOC is coming, but we don't know exactly where we're going yet. So uh, to kind of hold the expectations or to put the expectations on hold until we could come up with policies. Then I began going down one day a week to continue that work for 4 years. And one day, two attorneys from the Department of Labor came over and said they had a case at what was then called Memphis State University. It's now called the University of Memphis, for equal pay for women in the music department there. And could I become their expert and testify about how faculty salaries are set? And I agreed to that and went down with that team and sat in the courtroom for 4 or 5 days and uh, began a career then as the Department of Labor's equal pay expert, which I did for 3 or 4 years for on behalf of women who had brought the cases. Then I began being contacted by lawyers to represent women who were being discriminated in tenure cases and did 4 or 5 of those cases. And the last government employment occurred in 2002 and lasted till 2005. And what I was responsible there was looking at the way universities were dealing with race in terms of admissions and in terms of faculty employment. And the Department of Education sent a team, including myself, around to various campuses to talk to administrative leaders about what kinds of policies they were actually implementing. That was very challenging because the administrative leaders oftentimes, either because they believed in very ambiguous concepts or because those are the only concepts they were willing to discuss. But it was at that point that the Department of Education became interested in what's going on with the treatment of race in admissions and faculty employment, and to what extent were universities, we really went to major places, to what extent were they consistent with the 14th Amendment and with Title VI? It resulted in a report that when the administration changed, was buried. So it never really had any long-term impact, but it did create a record that said something was wrong, that universities were using race in a manner that eventually, when it came to the Supreme Court, would not survive scrutiny. So that was an experience that did not immediately have any policy impact, but perhaps in the long run it did. And it also equipped me to understand how these issues were being played out in higher education bureaucracies.
Hmm. Um, do you have a comment or an insight into how gender might be treated differently than race as a concern, or are these different periods you've addressed race versus gender? Because I mean they've been concerns for decades about getting more women or having parity with male salaries, say at the university level where professors are paid differently versus other racial issues, which I don't know that I don't know how involved, how connected they are to salary issues. But do you notice? Can you make a comparison there between how gender is treated versus race, or is that a legitimate comparison?
Well, it would require a generalization that would be really hard to make, but I can say this. Once Title IX was passed, then the issue of discrimination against women in various aspects of higher education was quite clearly on the agenda.
Hmm.
And their universities needed to equalize opportunities, salaries for women, and largely politically, that was not a challenge for them. It was much more complex to deal with race because there were substantial gaps in the academic preparations among races and therefore in their representation. And so I think it was a much easier sell for universities, particularly after some court cases were decided, to say, we really need to look at our salary and promotion arrangements for women, uh, and did so to create more equity voluntarily than for race, where to try to have uh, racial proportional representation, which was a much more challenging activity.
I'm sure. Yeah. And we see this in the last since Donald Trump was elected in it to his most recent term. The dramatically simplified articulation of this, and in this case, I think the dramatic simplification is desirable. It's emphasis on merit, and as repetitious as it becomes to hear Donald Trump say it and his acolytes say it, um, I think there's real truth in this. That if somebody is competing for a job with someone else, that as much as possible, if you look at the merit of what they've accomplished in previous jobs and evaluate that in terms of scholarship, you could say, well, this woman has done exactly the same as this man. So why would we think of not paying that woman the same if she becomes a professor? Um, that speaks to fairness, where you're ignoring, rightly so, identity qualities like she's female, and looking at the merit of the person's qualifications. With race and with gender, however, there's with affirmative action, there's been the changing of standards in regarding race in some cases. I maybe that occurs in gender, in the context of gender, also with giving women a leg up, even though the scholarship doesn't have quite the merit of the male candidate, and seeing them differently based on their identity. Because we need more women, or we need more non-whites, we're going to make an exception to their lack of merit. So to me, that's a great clarifying achievement. Just look at merit as much as possible. And I know leftists would say, well, you're oversimplifying. You're simplifying things historically because blacks and women and Hispanics and others have been oppressed. You can't judge their merit based entirely on the same standards. That's the real issue. But how is this playing out now? I know is what you're discussing. Does this touch on the subject of disparity studies, or uh, disparity studies a different area? How does that work? Because I know that's been a focus of yours.
Well, I became interested after the Supreme Court decided in 1989, City of Richmond versus Crossan. That was a case in where the City of Richmond put a 30% quota on all of its public contracts for minority businesses. And the Supreme Court struck down that quota and said that you had to have that the use of race as a preference required a judicial standard of strict scrutiny. And strict scrutiny is the highest test that the court will apply. And it means that the government has to have a compelling interest. And when it has a compelling interest, it has to use race in a narrowly tailored way. And the court went on to say in almost a side comment by Justice O'Connor, that if you did a study that showed that firms that were comparably qualified, willing, and able, that firms of one race received many fewer dollar awards than firms of another race, then an inference of discrimination might appear. So when I first read that, I thought, well, wait a minute. The court has just suggested maybe this is a social science problem, examining outcomes in terms of various kinds of variables to see whether an inference of discrimination existed. So I created at UMBC the Project on Civil Rights and Public Contracts, which eventually became the largest publicly accessible resource for disparity studies in the country. We had 289 disparity studies, which when I retired, we gave to the Library of Congress, and the Library of Congress, that's where they now reside. And so I became interested in who was producing disparity studies and what they were finding. And what happened was that a number of small for-profit consulting companies began to produce disparity studies, and the governments that hired these consultants wanted them to support race-conscious programs. There was no misunderstanding about that. If you were going to pay a consulting company $600,000 in New York, $1.5 million, to do a disparity study, there's what social scientists call results-oriented studies. That is, you pay a consultant to tell you you should do something, but the consultant knows what it is that you're supposed to do. So these were results-oriented studies. Today, there are about 600 of them done at a cost of about $300 million. And I began testifying in court on behalf of plaintiffs who said that the quotas or preferences in public contracting were discriminatory. As a generalization, the plaintiffs won those cases. And then when you win and you're a trial expert, you get a lot more work. I also was hired by a number of governments to examine their procurement systems to see if any discrimination existed. So I did both trial work for plaintiffs and I worked for governments. And just a few months ago, I was the trial expert for plaintiffs in a case against the city of Houston, which is the fourth largest city in the country.
Mm-hmm. And the discrimination in these cases, does it take all different forms, or what is there a predominant focus of that discrimination?
Well, there are no procurement arrangements in the country that I know of that have an absolute quota, as Richmond did. Generally, what they do is they award bonus points for minority companies when they compete for contracts, or they require prime contractors to hire minority subcontractors as a condition for getting the contract. Now they surround this with a good deal of ambiguity, and that's why you have to have trials to try to get testimony about what's actually going on. And that can be laborious. In the case against the city of Chicago, the trial lasted 6 weeks, and I was in court for every day. But we won. So the problem is, of course, that governments have an enormous advantage in the amount of resources they can throw into these cases compared to a construction organization, or more particularly a particular construction company. In the case in Houston, the plaintiff is called Landscape, and it does landscaping work. 90% of its employees are Hispanic, but the owner is a white male. And he sued, and he couldn't possibly have sued without the support of the Pacific Legal Foundation, which represents him pro bono. And so in our case, which lasted a week, we had actually six members, including myself, working for PLF, that created some balance. And so the government did not have this overwhelming advantage in resources. But if you look at the history of disparity study litigation, which of course I have, a lot of cases were lost by plaintiffs because they didn't have the resources, or they hired to represent them the attorney that they used for construction-related issues. These were people who really did not have civil rights backgrounds, and they didn't have experts in the case. And so the court is confronted with a record created essentially by the governments. And it said, well, the record shows that the government thinks that there's discrimination, and this is the appropriate remedy. Now, what has created the fundamental change is a series of district and appellate court cases, and finally the Supreme Court's case in Students for Fair Admissions, which have just changed the legal rules dramatically and in favor of ending racial preferences. So the new wave of cases is one in which the plaintiffs uh, have so far universally won.
Mm. Yeah, the details of the cases in Texas and in Chicago. Maybe if you could just briefly elaborate on them. You said an owner of a company, a white guy, had 90% Hispanic landscaping crew. What? So the outline of the case was, where was the discrimination occurring? Allegedly.
Uh, well, there were two different defendants. There was a development corporation, a private district created by the state legislature called Midtown Development. And when you competed for a prime contract, uh, minority contractors competing with you got 10 points. And 10 points on a 100-point scale oftentimes was decisive in who got the prime contract. And so Landscape was losing some prime contracts because of that, and felt that that was a violation of the 14th Amendment. The city of Houston used a different system requiring prime contractors to seek out minority subcontractors or penalizing them if they didn't show what was called good faith effort. And the good faith effort was always determined by the bureaucrats who were in favor of the racial preferences. So it was a system that discriminated against non-minority subcontractors who had to be passed by, even though they could do the work with more quality and at less cost, because the procurement system rewarded the hiring of minority subcontractors.
And so this is an area where I'm fairly unacquainted with the trajectory of these cases, but in this case, because the owner of the company, the white guy, was not, he didn't fall into the Hispanic or Latino category, he wasn't considered a minority contractor, despite having
That's
90% employees who were Hispanic.
that's correct. And,
Doesn't
and,
doesn't that illustrate the absurdity of this? Because the impact is so largely in favor of his employees and the culture of the company itself, despite not having one leader who's not Hispanic, is largely Hispanic. It's
well, that point we certainly made a trial, but there's a larger issue here, and that is who gets to be a minority.
right.
And essentially, there were categories established, Black, of course, Hispanic, Asian, Native Americans. There actually were two Asian categories, Asian Pacific and then South Asian. And when you look at those categories, as courts have done now, they're very imprecise. Not only are you permitted to identify with the category, let's say your mother is Chinese and your father is Scotch Irish. Well, if for business reasons you decide you want to be an Asian, then you can. But if your ancestors were identified with any of those categories, then you can continue to be identified with those categories and receive the preferences. Now, one of the important changes in the law is that the courts are now saying those categories are nonsense. They do not reflect a reality in American society. Uh, Students for Fair Admissions is very strong on that point. Both the majority opinion and Justice Gorsuch's opinions really excoriate the idea that if a person is identified with one of those categories, that that person can receive an advantage, or that if a person is not identified with one of those categories, he can be treated negatively. So the Supreme Court is very strong on this, and there are a number of district and appellate court cases that also take that same position. So this whole concept that there are minority groups that are identified in these categories and that a person can be assigned to those categories, whether that person wants to be assigned or not to those categories. And that person's rights can be determined by that bureaucratic assignment. That is under serious assault now. And I think the law is not going to be changed on that. And that gets us to some extent, if you want to go there, in what Maryland was doing in higher education.
Yeah, sure, and we can get into that. I'll just add, this is redolent of times when things were truly charged racially, and I'm thinking back to 1930s Germany, where evaluation of one's racial and ethnic heritage was a primary concern in how you were treated within Germany and countries allied with Germany, and how it's an alarming echo of this. Where, listen, if you can show that you've had the right ancestry, ethnically or racially, you're going to be favored or disfavored. Probably favored in terms of getting a minority contract, and how deeply racially charged this is, and how it can be disconnected from one's culture, and how it can be reconnected with things that are purely biological concerns, and how troublesome all this is. And it's the other side of the coin of right wing thinking, what we consider right wing thinking, and obsession with race and heritage, now being adopted by leftists to advance positions, as opposed to just looking at someone with a series of a set of qualities that represent merit and appropriateness for a given task, and that being it. And it's very concerning. Maybe did you want to talk about the Maryland situation in education, or
Well, I think there's a relationship that I'd like to discuss. But
sure.
well, the beginning of the Maryland, of course, was its public institutions, except for UMBC, which was founded in 1966, were all segregated.
Mhm.
So Maryland has that ugly history of segregation. And it has a remnant in the fact that it has four HBCUs, historically black colleges and universities. And so it has never been a state in which uh, racial representation in its institutions were random or based strictly on merit, or were not based on race. In 2008, the state passed a law requiring all Maryland public campuses to reflect cultural diversity. That turned out to be a term that appears neutral or even attractive on its face, but in fact, it got defined in a very racially distinctive way. Um, by seeking cultural diversity, a campus had to create programs for underrepresented uh, minorities or traditionally underrepresented minorities. Now, the significance of the term traditionally underrepresented meant that HBCUs which were, if you look at faculty and students, are overwhelmingly black,
Right.
could still use racial preferences because blacks were traditionally underrepresented. The other significance of that term is there's no end to it. You don't ever, if your current statistics look to be perfectly representational, you still might use race because of traditional underrepresentation.
Mhm.
So the consequence of that is that as as the diversity, equity, and inclusion movement began to be very powerful in education elsewhere, and particularly so in Maryland. Every campus had to do annual reports showing how they were dealing with the question of underrepresentation or traditionally underrepresentation by race or ethnicity. So these annual reports became drivers as the campuses wanted to look good or satisfactory, at least to the people who were reviewing them. So the Maryland affiliate of the National Association of Scholars began to be interested in these reports. And we did two extensive analysis in 2023 and 2024 of what was going on campus by campus. It was the first time this kind of information had ever been compiled. These were public documents. These were required reports because of the 2008 legislation. And this was an enormous volunteer effort. Every member of the board had campuses that they were responsible for, and eventually there were two reports written. The 2023 report was written after the Supreme Court decided students for fair admissions, but the campuses had done their reports before that decision. So we had the advantage of looking at what campuses were doing in light of the Supreme Court's new rulings about race. But the campus reports reflected the realities of what was going on before that decision. And there were two problems we discovered. One is campuses were openly discriminating in terms of underrepresented minorities. And secondly, that they were compelling speech. They were asking faculty candidates, and I assume administrator candidates, to identify what they were doing to improve diversity, equity, and inclusion on their campuses, or what they had done in their professional careers and what they intended to do. So you had to come in and say, I have a history of doing something to increase diversity, equity, and inclusion, and furthermore, my agenda in research will follow that. So this was compelled speech. It had a number of implications. For one thing, as DEI became an increasingly partisan program, it meant that conservatives, Republicans could not get jobs. They couldn't pass the DEI test. And it also enforced then in departments, what have we done for DEI lately in our research, and and which speakers were invited to campus. That was a very important criteria in which speakers got invited to campus.
Mhm.
So
This is making me think of your not to interrupt you, please, you can conclude, but this is all touching on some of the topics that you addressed in Silent Stages, regarding the possibility of open dialogue on campus, and maybe that's a good segue into this.
well, let me finish with the NAS reports.
Yeah.
So we identified two problems. First, the continuation of the use of race to create representation, and that has an enormous impact on campus politics as well, because if certain races then are preferred, then they organize on the campuses and they exert pressure on administrations to get things that those particular racially identified organizations want. And there are also alumni organizations organized around racial concepts. So it is a very powerful change agent when you say what counts on our campus is what race you are and how often that race is represented in various ways. So we identified that problem. NAS published it. And then in 2024, after the campuses were fully aware of SFFA and had to write their annual statements with an eye to the fact that SFFA had been decided, we wrote a 51-page report on that. Both of these reports, incidentally, would be publicly available to anybody who wanted to see them. But we faced a problem. And the problem was that the Maryland educational establishment was vigorously against SFFA, vigorously against racial neutrality. And the state government, the only party that would have possibly have been interested in this question were the diminishingly few Republicans who were mostly interested in tax and business problems, and were not there was not a national there was not a logical political source to raise questions about what was actually going on. So the reports had very little traction. They're, I think, well documented. They're available, but they did not find a champion. Unlike, of course, what's happened in the Trump administration, and what's also happened in Congress, where we saw, for example, uh, Congress being extremely active when there were anti-Semitic protests on campuses, and campus presidents were called to testify before Congress, and several of them failed miserably, and then lost their jobs, and so there was leverage in the federal government to look at these things. There is no point of leverage in the Maryland state government, and so although we documented several things that were probably clearly illegal, there wasn't anything we could actually do to create change. Now, we did write the state attorney general, Anthony Brown, and said to him, "What advice have you given campuses about complying with SFFA?" Now, the attorney general's office issues advice all the time. It sues the federal government virtually monthly. But the response we got after several inquiries is that our advice to campuses is confidential and you can't see it. And we wrote back and said, but there's no litigation going on. So you give advice on all kinds of legal problems. Why can't we see? And they refused to release anything. We also wrote the Maryland Commission on Higher Education and asked how they were defining the concept of underrepresentation, and we got nothing back from them. And the Board of Regents have not been active. So there was essentially no point in Maryland politics where you could have any leverage to open up the issue and have a public discussion of it. And so these reports, which I think are extremely well documented, which our members worked very hard to produce, really have had very little impact.
Yeah, and I speak as one of those members who went through the websites and other material from multiple public universities in Maryland. Um, and I'm wondering a couple things. If another state where things weren't so dogmatically left wing might be a more fertile place to do this, or might be more open to these explorations, that's one thing. And the other very troubling term that you've used a couple times is traditionally underrepresented minorities in a particularly in a place like Maryland, where it is truly culturally diverse, where you have many Asian groups from East Asia, from India, groups from all over the world, not being traditionally represented in universities. I don't get a sense of organization from them, or a sense of grievance. It's limited more to the traditional, the expected places in the United States of African Americans, Hispanics, and to me, there's a disjunction there, where there are to limit underrepresented minorities to Blacks and Hispanics is incredibly narrow-minded, and I don't know how that works in this, but it seems an obvious discrepancy in this evaluation. Maybe you mentioned the presence of anti-Semitism, of course, in college campuses, and discrimination that's been felt by the Jewish community since developments in the Middle East. Do you want to discuss how that's been handled? Maybe in light of your book Silent Stages, which you wrote before many of these really compelling, disturbing issues arose in the last few years. The presence of free speech on campus or not, and how things have developed in terms of campus speech and the ability to protest peacefully versus the extremes of violent protest, and following through on discrimination against Jews and others on campus. Does that feed into this, or do the arguments in Silent Stages apply to this? And How is that relevant now?
I think they do. I mean, hold up a copy of the picture of the book. Uh, I had become interested in what kinds of subjects were debated on campus. Campuses almost always have a variety of speakers that come in on research topics or other kinds of things, but they're single speakers, uh, and the groups that attend the speeches are generally uh, related to departmental research questions. And the speaker has done research and has a database which only the speaker is aware of, and the speaker comes in and makes an argument and then leaves. Oftentimes, the speakers are friends of existing members of the faculty, so there's a certain replication there. There are rarely speakers who would come in and challenge the preferred positions methodologically or ideologically of existing faculty. So the question is then, what kinds of debates or forums where there are multiple perspectives uh, go on campuses where students can come in and hear different opinions, and where students who are not majoring in a particular subject still could hear speakers talking about the big issues that confront our country. Um, and so I did research looking at a stratified sample of 97 campuses and 26 law schools to see what got debated. And we looked at 24 different debate topics, all of the ones that you would think about: immigration, gun control, taxes, various foreign policy issues, etc. I had expected that while I was aware that there were many campuses, including UMBC, where debate virtually never takes place, public debates, that there would be some model campuses. There would be some campuses that really did a good job with this. And the disappointing thing was that those model campuses, at least among the 97 that I examined, which had enrolled almost 1 million students, there were no models. That we have a situation in higher education where the incentive system is such that nobody wants to invest in having public policy debates. So that if you had, for example, imagine trying to have a debate on immigration policy. Well, that might make some people very angry, but it also is something students should hear. There are multiple perspectives on this. They need to know about current enforcement. They need to know a little bit about the history of this. It would be, and if you're a chemist or a biologist, you wouldn't encounter that in class. So we have then large numbers of college students who never have the opportunity to hear debate or forums about the big issues that are affecting the country and their votes. Almost all college students can vote. So I think colleges have been very neglectful in this area. Um, Let me give you, I think, a very poignant example. Take
Mhm.
Columbia University.
Mhm.
When the October 7th massacre of Jewish residents occurred, Columbia was confronted with a number of protests, largely anti-Israel protests, which occupied buildings, set up tents on grounds. What did Columbia do? Columbia was an institution that had the resources and the location to have had the most important public policy debates about Middle Eastern policy. They didn't. They just dealt with the protest problem, and in some cases sided with anti-Semites. So here was an institution that had every possibility to say, we want to be an example of how controversial issues are handled. You can, of course, have these debates, put them on YouTube or distribute them nationally. Nobody did that. higher education just dealt with this as a protest issue, not as a subject that ought to be debated. And so this book, which is of course written before the October 7th issues, forecast that in a crisis moment, higher education would fail. It would not have the kinds of debates or forums, and some issues there are not just two sides, there are multiple sides, that students and the community. Suppose a college said, look, our community needs to have a debate on taxation policy, on school choice, on gun control, whatever the issue is. And we want the community to be able to hear these different points of view because we think that's our civic responsibility as our education institution. It didn't happen. Uh, as far as I know, there is not an institution in the country that spends as much on sponsoring debates as they do on their most minor sport.
Yeah,
And,
it's not
and
a laughing matter, but it's a good way of putting it. Yeah.
every institution that plays intercollegiate athletics has a director, has someone who handles communications and publicizes events. It doesn't happen on the question of the great civic issues of our time. And so the book is titled Silent Stages because it isn't as though it's an accident. It is a purposeful decision not to have these debates.
Yeah. What is it? I agree with all of your points, and um, especially the failure of universities to channel the manifestations of violence into something constructive, or um, offering as an alternative to violence and the crudities of protests, having debates that are unencumbered by attempts to cancel and establishing a forum so that extreme views can be voiced. Instead of that, they either don't do it, they act passively, or you have usually leftists acting to deplatform or censor more conservative views, uh, and have that kind of that fertile discussion that might offer an outlet for extreme view, what people consider in leftist academia extreme views, but they're coming out. And maybe it's partly, I think, the media just being attracted to. Most people wouldn't have heard of Columbia University in the last several years if it weren't for explosive political violence, much less be interested in some debate that's happening at Columbia. So the media is attracted to violence and these superficially interesting things happening. But do you see any change in that? Do you see any way of fostering debate among extreme views that's a way of sublimating or redirecting that energy? Or have you seen a change in that since Trump has taken over? Or is it as bad as it's ever been? I don't. I know you're retired, but you pay a lot of attention to what's going on campuses. You have thoughts on that?
Well, there are some organizations that have begun to sponsor debates. One of them is called Braver Angels. I think there's another organization called Constructive Dialogues, and the ACTA, the American Council of Trustees and Alumni, has taken an interest in creating debate opportunities. But that's a good thing. But given the enormous resources in higher education and the number of people involved, it affects a fairly small number. And the issue is not whether extreme voices should be heard. The issue is whether diverse voices should be heard. And you and I might say, well, that argument is not well supported, but fine. Uh, let students hear the critique of an argument that's not well supported. Uh, but I think three things can happen when students hear a good debate. And if you choose your participants carefully, debaters respect one another and will treat the subject in ways that are not demeaning to anybody. I participated in a debate at the University of Baltimore with the professor there on religious freedom. It was a very civil debate. I mean, we disagreed on some points, but they're reasonable disagreements. And if students hear one of these debates, there are a couple of outcomes. One is a student can say, you know, the position that I held going into this debate, I now can articulate much better than I could before. Or two, the position that I held before I went into the debate, you know, I think I'm wrong now. I think the other side has a better argument. Or three, the student could say, you know, there are really good arguments on both sides, and I am not convinced of the right side. I need to find out more. All of those positions are valid positions for a higher education institution to want to foster. And it just didn't happen when I wrote the book, and I don't think it's happening in any great extent today.
Yeah, and it makes you wonder why the left, prominently the left, in every case I can think of, has been so determined to deplatform or shout down speakers, often from established learned backgrounds with the most the most impressive qualifications, and often teaching at our best universities, um, and want to silence that sort of speaker. It's not as if there are, um, I guess there are some right wing zealots without educational qualifications who want to come in and do rabble rousing, and that exists on both the right and left. But these are scholars. I'm thinking of Charles Murray or others who've been deplatformed, sometimes violently, at Middlebury College years ago, um, and how if they're willing to shout down people who make very learned scholarly arguments about positions that they don't like, what does that really say, and what can be done to change that? And I don't know um, the answer to that.
Well, well, I think the only way to really change it is for colleges to begin to have programs. Maybe you might not pick the most controversial subject for your first debate, but to have a series of debates. After all, if you look at a sports schedule, these teams are playing 12 to maybe 50 games if it's a baseball
Mhm.
team. Uh, so you can schedule multiple debates, and at orientation and other ways of communication, you can say, look, here's why we're doing it. Here's some rules. And if you disrupt a debate, that's a serious offense, and you'll be escorted out. And possibly, if your disruption is of a serious nature, if you threw something or engaged in any physical activity, you could be arrested,
Mm.
because our institution stands for the concept of intellectual diversity, and that we regard it as an educational fundamental that students should hear and communities should hear debates or forums on the great issues that affect the future of our democracy. You shouldn't back down from that. It should just be firm. We're going to do this. It's going to be multiple subjects, going to occur various times of the year. Students from all disciplinary backgrounds are invited, and these occasions have to be treated with respect. And anybody who engages in activities that prevents students in the community from hearing multiple points of view is acting inconsistently with the ethos of our university, and there'll be penalties.
Very interesting, and compelling. And again, I'm thinking of sports analogies, which you touched on the tremendous attention paid to sports in virtually every college and university, with the larger universities with dominant college football teams or basketball teams receiving unbelievable amounts of attention and money being thrown. No one questions the rules surrounding the proceedings in a sport as well known as basketball or football, and the passions that are attached to these sports are the most passionate that people will get, that an alumnus will get from having gone to the University of Alabama or some other big football school. And that's a fairly universal phenomenon to alumni. Uh, therefore, sports have tremendous, have very clearly laid out rules about not just the sports themselves, but fan behavior. Or if you're going to respect this, your alma mater by going to a sport, then you're expected to behave in a certain way that doesn't involve throwing things on the field or hurting other players. And maybe there's something there to taking that and saying, well, if we can do it with sports, why can't we do that with differing with your enemy, your opponent intellectually, and say that person or that team or that representative of some other group should be treated with that kind of respect.
Yeah, at the beginning of many athletic contests, there'll be an announcement over the PA about the necessity to behave civilly and not to engage in certain kinds of behavior. There's a point I should have made, however, in answer to your question. The state of Florida passed a law about 3 years ago requiring that every public campus in Florida, four-year public campus in Florida, sponsor a minimum of five debates, public policy debates. And these debates are recorded so that, for example, if Florida State has a debate on immigration policy and the University of Florida has a debate on taxation policy, those debates would be available and they're recorded. They can be available to any citizen, but certainly to the other campuses. And that policy decision by the state of Florida is based on silent stages. The book was cited when they created that legislation. Now, the big campuses in the Florida system have 30, 40, 50,000 students. So having five debates a year is not an enormously taxing activity, but it's a beginning. And I wish I had the resources, or I hope some scholar in Florida studies what's actually happening here, what is debated and what impact it has. But I don't know, and I'm not certain anybody has actually followed up to see what the consequences were.
Fascinating. Yeah, and to see that the book has had that kind of impact and that level of attention. Do you feel that the impact of your books, your articles has had been as influential and been as satisfying for you to produce as, say, your work as an expert in testifying for um, various court cases? Do you find them complementary, or how does that work? Is it's all part of a similar effort to convey your ideas, or what's been more impactful?
Well, sometimes it's hard to tell what your impact is. I learned after the fact that Silent Stages was influencing the Florida legislature, and actually was invited to the University of Florida after the act was passed to talk about it. Uh, and you can have an impact at one moment, and then the public agenda changes, and it's what you've said is no longer really relevant to the new public agenda. But when I look back at uh, my career, I believe that on some topics, um, my research has had an impact. I think it has had an impact on how disparity studies are viewed by courts. I wrote a piece recently called "The Demise of Disparity Studies," talking about the impact of SFFA and other cases on disparity studies. But it's a big country. There are a lot of voices, and the impact of any specific scholar on these large issues is always hard to measure, and certainly not necessarily durable.
It, Absolutely, and I admire the work of you and other scholars who are so committed to producing material that's worth reading, and in by specialists in your own area, but also your work is accessible to laymen like me who aren't experts and not academics. Um, and I sometimes wonder about the amount of production within academia of worthwhile material, and yet the very limited impact a lot of specialized academic work has But I think in your case, there's a lot of overlap with contemporary disputes, contemporary debates, and that must be pretty satisfying. And this is an ongoing thing. The project of NAS and MAS and every state affiliate is an ongoing struggle is one way of seeing it, but continuous series of efforts with things like this, with interviews and continuing to produce articles and material to get people in these discussions. And unfortunately, uh, we have to say, opening up discussion in a country where debates are still suppressed and academics are still deplatformed. And it's sad to see, but I'm glad we have people like you, founding organizations like the Maryland affiliate, and we'll go forward. And I hope you will join us and for further discussions. George is still on the board of the Maryland Association of Scholars, and we'll be having more of these discussions in the future, I hope.
Well, thank you. It's good to talk to you, and I concur. The Maryland Association of Scholars can be an important voice, and I'm glad to be still a part of it.
Very good. Thank you very much again, Professor George La Noue, and we'll be seeing more of him in further discussions along with other distinguished academics. And we'll see you next time. Thanks.
Thank you, Tom.